koutou. Very big pleasure for me to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Mary van Andel. I'm the Chief Veterinary Officer at the Ministry for Primary Industries. I have been in the role since August 2021. Previously, we did have a Chief Veterinary Officer in New Zealand, but we didn't for about a decade. And then for a bunch of reasons, people decided that perhaps we should have one again. So I'm doing my best not to be disappointing. So I thought I might tell you a little bit about what the role does, or what the job description says the role does. And I might tell you a bit about what I've been doing as well. So the job description has my work kind of in three buckets. It has me representing New Zealand internationally with the World Organization for Animal Health and with our Quads partners. It has me being the professional lead for MPI veterinarians and liaising with private vets as well via the New Zealand Veterinary Association, the Council, and the Vet Skill. And then it also has me, fighting for the animal health system in New Zealand. So those are kind of the three buckets. There's a bunch of different activities that I've been doing in those different buckets, and one of the big ones is about our foot and mouth disease work program, and that kind of I count in the animal health system. So I'm going to talk about that, and then there are probably things that people want to ask, and you can ask. You don't have to only ask about this presentation. You can ask about anything, and I'll try and answer. And if I can't answer, you should send me an email. Someone will be able to give you my email address, and I'll do my best to answer it by asking, to being able to connect you with the right people. Right. Oh yeah, and so I did think perhaps people know, perhaps they don't. There are about 300 veterinarians who work in MPI. About 60% of those work in the verification services, so they work in our processing plants, and they do certification and meet the requirements of our international markets, right? So that's what they do. The rest of us work across animal welfare, biosecurity, ACVM, assurance, whole bunch of stuff across all the remit of what MPI does. And that's something that even vets in MPI don't always know where all the other vets in MPI work. And certainly when I've talked to private practice colleagues, they don't know that either. And so that's another thing that I do sometimes talk about, which I enjoy talking about a lot. Anyway, foot and mouth disease. This is a presentation that we've been giving a lot, as you can imagine, because of the outbreak of foot and mouth disease that was announced by Indonesian colleagues to the World Organization for Animal Health in May this year. And that was an outbreak that had happened there for the first time in about 35 years. So Indonesia was free of foot and mouth disease, and the first time in 35 years identified it in the archipelago, and that's continued to spread across the archipelago, and been a challenge for colleagues there to control. Guess at that time, New Zealand and Australia had some kind of discussions, and we talked to our colleagues, and we have different levels of risk based on this finding for New Zealand compared with Australia. But regardless of that, it's a really good opportunity for us to look at our planning and to think about what's happening there in terms and in the light of what we've learned from a huge all-of-government response to an infectious disease that we've had in the last 3 years, which is the COVID-19 response, and also what we've learned from the Mycoplasma bovis program over those years. So that's what our planning is about, figuring out how we incorporate those learnings, making sure that we are ready, and what we need to do. So see how we go. Still free of foot and mouth disease. We've never had a case here in New Zealand. Actually, that finding in Indonesia hasn't significantly changed our risk of incurring foot and mouth disease, interestingly. Even for Australia, who are quite a lot closer to Indonesia, it changed their risk from, I think, was it 1 to 19% was the previous risk of it being incurred into Australia in the next 5 years. It changed it to 3 to 21%. Right? So some of those numbers and how they've been reported is been some license with that, I guess. So that was their risk. Our risk hasn't significantly changed. But as we've talked about, taking this opportunity to look at our planning, and obviously an incursion of foot and mouth disease would be catastrophic to New Zealand and to all of us here. We can't do this by ourselves. Everybody has a part to play here. And so a lot of our work is about working across government, also with industry partners. Okay, so it's probably not news to anyone. Really infectious disease. It affects productivity. It's not a food safety problem, and it doesn't infect humans, but it affects humans. And humans move this disease around by their activities. Humans move animals around. Humans move equipment around. Humans move animal products around. And that's how disease can spread. And so although foot and mouth disease doesn't infect people, it would affect us all if we got this. And the reason for that is that our ability to trade in animal products would stop. Our trading partners would not receive any more products. All our certification would be suspended. We would actually need to get in touch with our trading partners, and any product that had left from New Zealand in the 28 days prior to us finding the first case in New Zealand would need to be recalled or destroyed. So that's how seriously the World Organization for Animal Health takes this, and that's also the kind of rules that we would expect our trading partners to comply with if something like this happened to them. Loads of countries have FMD. 77% of all susceptible animals live in countries that have foot and mouth disease, right? So we're kind of in the minority of countries in terms of our free status. The red circle is Indonesia. The red countries are countries that have it endemically, so constantly outbreaks circulating. Yellow countries intermittent. Green countries managing foot and mouth disease. The combination of controlled areas and vaccination. People can trade with foot and mouth disease and with vaccination from foot and mouth disease, but those conditions on their trade are way less favourable than what we have here in New Zealand. So if we did land up having foot and mouth disease, or our ability to trade in the way we do now would be severely changed. In Indonesia, they've had an approach to vaccinate. They're vaccinating there, right? They're vaccinating a lot of animals. They've vaccinated around 5 million. They have, you can see their epidemic curve there. This is the subject of some discussion amongst epidemiologists where I work, because I think that, in a highly infectious disease that affects multiple species, if we vaccinate only a particular species, we can see they're mainly vaccinating beef cattle up there, and that's because of where the value and production is for Indonesia. We may see the reporting of cases tailing off, but it's likely that cases are still being infected and animals are still moving around. But certainly the reporting of cases trending down. Got some kind of districts or provinces where there are no further cases being reported. But as people will appreciate, clinical signs in sheep and goats and those types of animals really can be quite subtle and might not be being seen. So probably some underreporting going on there. We've talked to that one. Vaccination progress, yep, mostly beef cattle being vaccinated, and mostly beef cattle being identified as being affected, which isn't a surprise because of the way Indonesia keeps beef cattle, right? So they keep them kind of in groups, they're significant feedlots, so that's not a surprise about where people have seen cases, where people have reported cases, and how vaccination's being applied. This is a graph from our team about, how much travel comes from Indonesia, what type of things come from Indonesia to New Zealand. We mostly we don't. So let me just see what the next slide is. Oh yeah. Okay. We'll cover over this in the next short time. But seeing as we've got the slide up here, what comes from Indonesia to New Zealand? A lot of glass comes here. A lot of Nike shoes come here. A lot of toilet paper comes here, right? So we're not talking about goods that have a high risk of bringing foot and mouth disease into New Zealand. But what we have done in this previous kind of preceding couple of months is we've been really focusing on examining those containers of things that come to New Zealand in terms of their contamination of the outside of the containers. Our input health standards about what can come into New Zealand from Indonesia are quite restrictive, so no high-risk goods were coming in anyway, so none of that had to be stopped, nothing was coming anyway. But in terms of, the having a look at the containers, that's been really carefully done, and now we're able to understand that the risk of that is really, really negligible. And then also, quite a few people coming from New Zealand, but nothing like the volumes that Australia is experiencing from Bali and so on. So we'll touch on that again in the next slides. Talked about this. Case here would halt all export trade in most animal products. We'd lose our status with our trading partners. Because we wouldn't be able to trade in animal products and export products, there would be significant impact on farmers, rural communities, all of us really, because we wouldn't be able to get that money into the country. And we would need all of government to respond and all of industry as well. Okay. We've talked about the layers of defence that the New Zealand biosecurity system provides. And we've talked about import health standard. That's kind of the most outside layer. We have the import health standards in place all the time, and that's, that means that we don't import any live animals, germplasm or unprocessed meat products or animal products from countries that have a significantly different exotic disease standard than we do. And so we weren't bringing any of that from Indonesia anyway. And we'd not only worried about foot and mouth disease in this regard, but a whole lot of other animal diseases that would affect our national herd. So with that in place, and with the additional measures at the border that are there, the route that remains for incursion of foot and mouth disease into New Zealand is really the illegal import of unprocessed meat products, right? So for that reason, we've got the detector dogs at the border. We've also got the 100% X-ray of all baggage that comes on. It's also one of the reasons why the green lane was stopped back during COVID. And so those are the type of measures that can really focus on illegally imported products. There's also at the mail centre, the dogs work in the mail centre as well to check over the mail and understand or identify when things are coming through there. You may have, if you've been lucky enough to travel internationally, you may have noticed that there is additional education information and kind of engagement material at the border, and that's to do with kind of what needs to be reported, what needs to be declared, why it's an issue, and that type of information. I think there are also cabin announcements on airplanes and that type of thing as well. There's also been, let's see, oh yeah, that's all right. There's also been profiling of people that come from Indonesia and sending those people towards an increased intensity of checking and that type of measure, including shoes and footwear and that type of thing. So what is the task force doing? What are we doing for readiness? Talked about how we want to get a kind of operational blueprint for an FMD response and kind of come up to date with incorporating our learnings from COVID and Mycoplasma bovis into those plans. There's currently a task force and a task force director who I work closely with, and they're working across 27 projects, I think over 16 themes, and that's across all of MPI. So it's not only the biosecurity part, but also the trade part, animal welfare, rural support, workforce planning, so a huge remit of things. Because of the scale of this type of response, we would need a large and coordinated effort. So we've done some things to strengthen our plans. There is now the Chief Veterinary Officer role that has kind of some of these roles about working with private veterinarians. In that space, we've kind of, and some of you may have been interviewed in this regard, got some ongoing work to understand how we build a enduring mechanism for MPI and private vets to work together so that we can do better than the Mycoplasma bovis experience. That was very difficult for all of us and has been acknowledged as being something that can definitely be improved. So that's an ongoing piece of work that I'm involved in. Of course, we've got NATE that has improved to some degree, but it only covers cattle and deer, so there's additional work that's happening and consultation and discussion working together between MPI colleagues and industry about sheep. There's been a lot of learnings about how we would do compensation for a biosecurity Act event. But in this type of event, we would need compensation for animals that were destroyed in the event of an outbreak, but also to be able to support local businesses and rural communities. So there's something that's bigger than what's required underneath the Biosecurity Act, and that's why we need to work with MSD, with Treasury, with colleagues from across government to be able to understand how that would look. You will have heard about the biocontainment laboratory at Wallaceville, which has been built with a large exotic disease outbreak in mind. We do have a vaccine bank, which is offshore, which we can talk about. And then we've got, equipment stores and this all of government work that's ongoing. So those are the types of activities that are, I guess, themes across all of those 27 projects and 16 themes. And those are things that we've kind of been building on. This isn't a surprise to people here. Farm-to-farm movements of animals here, NATE-registered animals, I would say cattle and deer for one day. And this isn't ones that go to processing. So it's no sheep, goats or pigs, but you can see that a lot of animals move in New Zealand, right? In New Zealand, we move animals to feed. We don't move feed to animals. Other countries move feed to animals. And that's a problem for being able to contain a fast-moving disease. What would it look like? What would happen? You may be aware, so there's, hopefully you're aware, there's the Exotic Pest and Disease Hotline that I see some colleagues here work at, and that 0800 80 99 66, that number is manned 24/7 by a veterinary epidemiologist who, and pretty much for this reason, right? We want to have a service where any veterinarian or farmer can ring a number, talk to an epidemiologist at any time, and have the opportunity to report if they thought they had a case of foot and mouth disease in New Zealand, and it's available for any exotic disease, to be honest, but the speed issue is really an issue for things that spread really quickly. So if somebody triggers that, a veterinarian can be on that property from the initial investigating veterinarian network that's across New Zealand, can be on that farm within 4 or 5 hours, regardless of where the farm is, because these colleagues are based across New Zealand. And then that colleague can have a look at that case, understand if they are comfortable to rule it out based on their knowledge, or they can call in the lab again and we can arrange for sampling to happen and for a more highly qualified expert to attend with them and see what's happening on that farm. At that point, probably want to start thinking about movement restrictions and how we limit the spread of a possible disease into the rest of the population. Very quickly, the Animal Health Laboratory at Wallaceville will be able to test those samples and confirm or stand down that farm. But what I guess the message here is that when one has the first case of a disease that you've identified, one really hopes that it's the first case in the country, but you just don't expect that. When we find a case of a disease like this, we know we're going to trace back, we're going to trace forward, and we're going to expect that there are other farms affected. And for that reason, there will be a national standstill of susceptible animals that gets called in the event of foot and mouth disease being identified in New Zealand. That's on there. There's also on here this issue that we talked about export of products, and then some checkpoints and signs, and bringing in the all of government colleagues. So that's on that timeline. Talked about a national livestock standstill. Animals must stay where they are or proceed to where they were on their way to. There's some obvious exceptions there. Things that are going to sale yards, probably not going to go to sale yards. But if there are multiple animals that have been aggregated up, then those animals will have to go somewhere and be taken care of. The issue is that any movement that could expose another sector of the population to disease needs to be dealt to, right? So things we wouldn't want anything crossing the Cook Strait, because obviously having one island that was free of disease would be a big win for operations and being able to contain things. Because of our reliance on trade for the primary sector, we would be looking to eradicate this disease. the first step there is to delimit the size of the outbreak, and then to try and, so delimiting, national movement standstill, delimiting work, and then shrinking those areas that are under controls as it's safe to do so, so that other activities can resume and continue. Every single one of these steps needs to balance off the impact on people, animals, and the economy with the chance of spreading disease further, right? So all of these are hard. All of these will involve trade-offs. All of these will involve a huge amount of discussion in the very tight timeframes with people who actually understand how these production systems work and how we're going to move forward. The message is, though, that if we have a single case of foot and mouth disease, all of our exports will stop, and they'll only resume once we've proven to the World Organization for Animal Health and to our trading partners that it's safe for them to trade with us. And so that'll only resume once the outbreak is adequately contained, controlled, removed from the population. And so those really are the things that we're going to have to be balancing off there. So the way we've started to talk about these preparedness issues is, it's clear that similar to, I guess, what we had in COVID, we're going to need a framework where we can talk about different parts of the countries being under different levels of restriction and different surveillance activities happening in those different levels, in those different regions. And so what we're working on is a framework that we can talk to people about so that they can understand what would happen next for them, what type of activities they can expect, and what type of restrictions they can expect. So that's work that the team is carrying on with. I think I've been asked probably as many times as I've done this presentation, so probably around 80 times, why we haven't yet vaccinated all New Zealand cattle for foot and mouth disease. So the reason is that we are free from foot and mouth disease without vaccination in New Zealand. This is our status for trade. If we were to vaccinate this population, we would no longer have that status, and we would need to renegotiate all our trade to be free from foot and mouth disease with vaccination. In addition, if we are going to be free from foot and mouth disease without vaccination, we don't know what strain of foot and mouth disease we would get into New Zealand. And so our vaccine bank in the UK has a suite of antigens that have been selected based on what the most likely strain that would be incurred into New Zealand would be. And in the event of this happening, the strain from the index case that we found would be sequenced, and that information sent immediately to the vaccine laboratory so that they could construct the vaccine from the antigens that they have there to be able to be the most effective against the strain that we have. Because we wouldn't be using vaccination to stop animals from getting clinical signs, we would be using vaccination as a tool to be able to eradicate. So we'd be using vaccination in a kind of fire break way or in a ripple out way to stop the spread of the disease so that we could delimit and eliminate the disease from the population. So a completely different type of use of vaccination from what we saw with, for example, COVID, or what we see with vaccinating for endemic diseases. So that's kind of quite an important difference in terms of how we would be using vaccination as a tool in our toolbox for disease control. That we would need to be doing surveillance before, during, and after there are active cases known in New Zealand, right? So in terms of surveillance before, that's where we are now. We're focused on keeping it out. And what's happening now in terms of surveillance is the knowledge of private veterinarians about what foot and mouth disease looks like, their interaction with the exotic pest and disease hotline, and our kind of ongoing scanning at processing plants via industry, so all of that passive surveillance, because what we're doing here is looking for a disease that has really that has clinical signs, right? And so if we have an engaged population of people who are dealing with animals on a daily basis and they're looking for those clinical signs, that's the fastest way to find this type of disease. During an outbreak, we would need to do something different. We would still have passive surveillance by veterinarians and by farmers, and those report cases would be investigated. But what we would also need to do is be following up traces, or we would need surveillance in particular zones around known cases, and then we would need probably some kind of scanning surveillance, for example, using bulk tank milk, similar, across the country, so that we could really focus in on where disease is present versus where disease isn't. After we think that all active cases have been removed from the population, we would still have to do more surveillance, because we need to assemble a dossier of information for our trading partners and for the World Organization for Animal Health to prove that we don't have the disease. And so then we would have to do more blood testing and more surveillance to be able to get back that status. So there would be, significant surveillance activities that will happen at different times, and those surveillance activities will be different depending on the stage of the outbreak. This line is in here because of things we learned from COVID. So during COVID, you might remember that there were lots of people who did models for COVID, and that was great. Some of them were great. Some of them we spent a lot of time explaining what they meant to decision makers. And so what MPI has done over many years is invest in a stochastic simulation model of foot and mouth disease spread in New Zealand, and that has been invested in over a long time, and the parameters for that are constantly being updated. And the best use of those models, in my opinion, is to prepare for what you will do in the face of an outbreak, rather than using those models to model while an outbreak is happening, right? And so we've got those models, we've got New Zealand-specific parameter sets, and those models are being used in planning for how we might respond to foot and mouth disease. Should it be introduced in a particular region? Should it be, and if we should use, what type of tactics we should use? Should we use vaccination? Should we not use vaccination? Should we vaccinate animals and let them live out their productive life once they've been vaccinated? Should we vaccinate them and then remove them from the population? So that's what those models are used for. We have them, and there's certainly a place for other modelling techniques and to use those, but I think it's good to know that we have that one and that it's ongoing, and that we continue to use that one and refine it. Okay. Foot and mouth disease controls don't control people. Under the Biosecurity Act, we control risk goods and susceptible animals and germplasm. So we don't stop people from moving, but we do stop risk goods from moving. And things like vehicles or tractors of farm equipment, those can be risk goods, they can be contaminated, and they might be able to move based on some kind of permitting or some kind of measures that are taken to clean those and make them safe to be moved. You can imagine that if we had to have a big area that was under controls, that being able to permit these different things would be a logistically difficult undertaking, and to make sure that people were doing the behaviours that were required to stop disease from spreading. So that's a focus of work for the teams. Totally acknowledge that this would have terrible, severe effects on farmers and community, and really urgently need to incorporate those lessons from Mycoplasma bovis and other responses, including COVID, into how that support would look. One of the things that was very clear from Mycoplasma bovis program was that a dedicated place manager for any infected farm was needed, so that farmers had the relevant support so that they'd be able to interact with the system of all these other groups that needed to do things to the farm, and to provide that single point of contact. And we really need to figure out how to join up this support so that people aren't overwhelmed, so people understand how to navigate this, and so that we are able to support people through what would be a very, very difficult time. All right. So on-farm biosecurity, where we are now, definitely the clinical signs reporting, that's what we really need to focus on. That's a call to the vet, or MPI 0800 18 99 66. Someone in the team will get back to you regardless of the time. And the clinical signs that we're looking at there is drooling, smacking of lips, shaking, shivering, lameness, pyrexia, ulcers and blisters on the teats and the mouth and muzzle, and then drop in milk yield. Recently we've had a refresher course for those veterinary colleagues who had gone on exotic disease training in Nepal with our colleagues from EUFMD, and that was well received. and some good conversations there to remind people about what they were looking for. And then, yep, so that's the one thing. Also been a lot of work by the team in that man the Exotic Pest and Disease Hotline about distributing relevant materials to remind people what they're looking for there. Looking for people to kind of keep up to date on the NATE and farm records. We know that that's going to be super important to be able to find what has come on and off of those farms. And then the on-farm biosecurity, for example, not feeding uncooked swill to pigs, because as we talked about, the most likely path of incursion into New Zealand would be the illegal importation of a risk animal product, and then that entering the food chain, right, and being fed to pigs. Pigs amplify the virus, so they would be able to infect a lot of other animals because of the way the virus interacts with their bodies. So no swill feeding of uncooked swill to pigs. We are also asking people who have had contact with livestock in countries with foot and mouth disease to not go onto New Zealand farms for 7 days, or not to have contact with susceptible animals. Those measures are aligned with our colleagues in Australia and with our colleagues at the European Commission for Control of Foot-Mouth Disease, so EUFMD. There's not a scientific paper that I can point to that says that 7 days is the thing, but compared with accidentally transferring it, I think that asking people to do that seems a reasonable thing to do. Yeah, so that's the end of that one. Happy to do questions.